All right, welcome back to our last video in our cell module. This last video, we will cover the remaining organelles in eukaryotic cells. So we'll be talking about mitochondria, chloroplasts, and the cytoskeleton. So the proteins that help move and give structure to the cell. So one of the key things that we talked about in our first lecture, so chapter 1, is that there is this transformation of energy that occurs throughout all ecosystems and all natural environments, basically. And it enters living systems. That energy is converted from one form to the other, and then you have energy that is lost as heat to the environment and creates the entropy or the disorder in the environment, in the system. And so what we're going to look at here is basically the two organelles that help with the conversion of this energy in living organisms. And what we're going to first start off with are the chloroplasts. And so chloroplasts are important because this is where photosynthesis happens in plants. And photosynthesis is the conversion of solar radiation into glucose into organic molecules. So you're going from this inorganic form of energy to an organic form of energy through chloroplasts, and that gets the energy into the food web and into these biotic parts of the system. Most of the living world runs on energy that comes from the process of photosynthesis, so it's really important process that happens. All of the processes that happen in natural environments important, but photosynthesis is kind of that energy driving process. And chloroplasts are, these individual organelles that are inside of cells, and you can find these organelles in the cells of plants and algae that undergo that photosynthetic process. And so they're the specific organelle that is performing that process. If you look at the structure of a chloroplast, this is what you would see. So the chloroplast is this double membrane structure, and inside that inner membrane is a fluid called the stroma. And the stroma is the fluid inside the chloroplast, so it's in that, in the inner membrane. And then inside the stroma, you'll have these stacks of what looks like pancakes. Okay, so these little things here. The stacks of those pancake-looking structures are referred to as granum. And each of the pancakes in that stack is a thylakoid. Okay, so the chloroplast has the double membrane. Inside the inner membrane, you have the stroma. And in the stroma, you have granum, which are made up of individual thylakoids. Okay, and so the process of photosynthesis happens in the chloroplast itself, and we'll spend a lecture talking and going over the process of photosynthesis itself. And now the other organelle that you find in cells or eukaryotic cells is mitochondria. And mitochondria are in almost all eukaryotic cells. This is where the process of cellular respiration happens. So where the organism converts glucose into ATP. So photosynthesis takes solar radiation and converts it into glucose. And then cellular respiration takes glucose and turns it into ATP. And ATP is what we use to fuel a lot of our cellular processes. So that's the direct form of energy for work that we have going on in our cells. And I want to kind of, address a statement that a lot of times you'll hear is that plants have chloroplasts and animal cells have mitochondria. This statement, the way it's worded, has some flaws to it, because plant and animal cells have mitochondria. Plant cells only have chloroplasts. And so that's the way that sentence should be structured, because again, mitochondria is taking glucose and converting it into ATP through cellular respiration. Chloroplast is taking solar radiation, inorganic energy, and converting it into organic energy in the form of glucose. So the reason we eat other organic molecules like plants and animals is because we need the glucose in order to run energy, or in order to get energy through cellular respiration. However, plants can make their glucose molecules through photosynthesis, and then their mitochondria breaks those glucose molecules down into ATP. So they don't need to eat, most plants don't need to eat other organisms unless they're like a Venus flytrap or a pitcher plant where they, consume organic material that way. And so that's why we should kind of think about what that statement really says and make sure we use it in a correct way. So here's an example of mitochondria. We have a artist rendition and then a micrograph on the right hand side. And again, the mitochondria is where cellular respiration occurs. And so cellular respiration occurs generally at the inner membrane of the mitochondria. The mitochondria is also this double membranous structure. A portion of cellular respiration does not happen in the mitochondria, so glycolysis does not happen in mitochondria, but most of the cellular respiration process does, and it mostly happens on that inner membrane structure. And that's why it's really highly folded. And so you can see the folds on that inner membrane, and that's to create more surface area for more cellular respiration to happen. And so really, in the scheme of our city, chloroplast and mitochondria are our power plants, right? So if we look at our cell, you have your power plant, which are chloroplast, mitochondria. You have kind of your city hall, which is the nucleus giving out instructions. You have your workers, which is the proteins. You have your buses, your transportation systems, which are the vesicles, the UPS trucks, etc. You have your manufacturing facilities, which are the endoplasmic reticulum, and the ribosomes, the free-floating ribosomes. And then you have your kind of Amazon packaging facility, which is the Golgi apparatus. So that's kind of how I think of the cell and relate to the different functions of what each organelle does. Now, what's also interesting with chloroplast and mitochondria is that they have their own DNA. And so there's mitochondrial DNA, there's chloroplast DNA, and then you have your nuclear DNA. So nuclear DNA is DNA found in the nucleus, and then your mitochondrial and chloroplast DNA is the DNA found in those two organelles. And that's really interesting that both of those organelles have their own individual DNA. And the DNA is actually a single circular chromosome that reminds you of a prokaryotic chromosome. And what's also interesting about these organelles is that they can reproduce themselves. So they can basically bud off and create identical copies of the organelle. And so that's really interesting because those properties resemble what we see in prokaryotic organisms. And so there's evidence that's been found and discussed that suggests that we actually got mitochondria and chloroplasts from endosymbiosis, where a cell early on in Earth's history may have engulfed a prokaryote, a free living prokaryote, and then that prokaryote it established a symbiotic relationship with the cell that engulfed it and started making energy for it. And so that would have been the mitochondria. And then we think another event happened where a cell with a mitochondria engulfed a chloroplast like molecule, and then that ended up with a cell having both chloroplast and mitochondria. And so again, this is referred to as endosymbiosis, and that's how we think our mitochondria and chloroplast organelles became established in eukaryotic cells, and then that there were two endosymbiotic events. So the first mitochondria and then the second chloroplast. And so eventually over time, that symbiotic relationship became really strong. And now our cells can't function if we don't have mitochondria, and plant cells can't function if they don't have chloroplasts and mitochondria. All right, so some of the last structures we're going to talk about in our cell module is the cytoskeleton. And so the cytoskeleton is basically the scaffolding and the networking of the cell itself. So the cytoskeleton are these protein fibers, so microtubules and microfilaments that run throughout the cytoplasm. And it serves as both something similar to a skeleton and also the muscles of the cell. So it supports the cell, keeps it from collapsing in on itself, but it also helps with movement of molecules and stuff inside of the cell itself. And so cytoskeleton is really there for that mechanical and structural support. And so like I mentioned, the cytoskeleton has a lot of different fibers that is kind of put into that group, so the cytoskeleton group. One of those are called microtubules. Microtubules are these hollow tubes of protein. And then there's also microfilaments and intermediate filaments, and those are much more thinner and solid when compared to microtubules. And so what these protein fibers do is they really anchor organelles to inside the cell and keep them in place. But then other organelles can kind of use the cytoskeleton for movement, almost like a monorail or like a zip line to help move it across the cell. So here we have some figures of microtubules in the cytoskeleton, and then another image of microtubules and how they can grow out to help facilitate movement of those cells themselves. And other protein structures that exist in eukaryotic cells are that fact that microtubules can be arranged into structures called flagella and cilia. And so these are basically extensions of the cell, like we've seen in the prokaryotic image in the beginning, of protein structures that allow for movement. So for example, a eukaryotic flagellum will propel a cell through an aquatic environment as a flagellum basically moves like a whip, undulating, propelling that cell forward. Generally, flagellum are singular, but you can find them in groups, for example, on protists or other prokaryotes. And one of the more common flagellum examples that you can think of is the flagellum that's on a human sperm cell. And then kind of the final structure that we're going to mention is cilia or cilium. These are similar to flagellum, but they're typically shorter and much more numerous. So there's usually a lot of cilia and there's only like a single flagellum. Cilia move in kind of this back and forth motion. So you can think about it as, kind of like blades of grass in the wind, or anemones under the water and the ocean water, kind of how they kind of move back and forth. That's kind of what cilia looks like. And both of these help propel cells through the water, but cilia can also help with the movement of foreign objects, say, out of our respiratory system. So for example, our human trachea, so the trachea is lined with cilia, and there's mucus in that as well that helps to trap foreign objects, and then the cilia will push that mucus up and out of our respiratory system. So that's why you actually cough up mucus when you're sick, or if you have, inhaled something in your lungs, or particles or debris. That's basically how one way that's pushed out is through the aid of that cilia. So here you have a figure with flagellum, so that long single flagellum, but then lots of multiple cilia in the respiratory tract of humans. We also have a video here of a paramecium, and you can see the cilia kind of undulating back and forth in this video. So just a little example there of what cilia looks like in motion. And so just to end up with like a final note of flagellum is they're actually really important in reproduction, which we know, but flagella in general. And so flagellum are really important for the movement, so allowing the sperm to reach the eggs. And so if you have problems with your flagella, then it can lead to issues with infertility. And so there's this hereditary sterility that can exist because there is issues with the structure of the flagella in the sperm cell. And so there's some kind of maybe a mutation or something wrong with the protein structure in the flagellum, because flagellum are actually moved by these rods of microfilaments that kind of do like this, up and down, contracting and relaxing. So you can imagine if it's a long cylinder tube with those rods in, when you pull and push one, it kind of moves the tail like this. And if you do the opposite way, it pulls it back. And so that's what makes that movement. So if there's something wrong with that, then the sperm won't swim straight, or maybe it'll swim in a circle, or maybe it just doesn't swim at all. And you could have infertility problems. And so it's really important, for the proteins to be correct in those structures. And so that's it with our discussion on cells and the different structures, organelles that we find in cells. And so this does it for module 3. In terms of the lecture material, just make sure you go through and finish all the assignments and quizzes and discussions for module, not module 3, but the module 4, the cell organelles. And so thank you all, and I hope you have a good rest of your week, and we will see you in the next module.